Thank you, John. Is the level okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I want to thank John and the library for inviting me to their History at Home program. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm pleased to see such a nice audience today. So by the time I entered first grade in the mid-1970s, the sisters were largely gone from the schools. In fact, I didn't have a nun as a teacher until my sophomore year in high school. So most of my impressions of sisters and nuns came from the popular media. So things like the Bells of St. Mary's,
Right.
the Nun Story, the Blues Brothers.
Oh, yeah.
So it wasn't until I started working for CSA that I came to fully understand and appreciate everything that the sisters have done in our society. So as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of this country, I think it's important we acknowledge the contributions they have made and are continuing to make in the fields of education, healthcare, social services, and justice and peace. So I believe that no history of the United States is complete without examining the impact of women religious in this country. So during my presentation, I'd like you to keep in the back of your mind a few numbers I'm going to throw at you. So in 1860, there were 45 women's religious congregations in this country with about 5,000 sisters. In 1900, there were 170 congregations with 50,000 sisters. And in 1930, 300 congregations with 135,000 sisters. So tonight I'm just focusing on the efforts of the Sisters of St. Agnes in the fields of education and healthcare. But I want you to keep these numbers in mind because, while I'm just focusing on CSA, I think CSA's story is representative of what was going on with all these other congregations throughout the country. So while every religious community has their unique story, they were all part of a widespread mission-focused effort that filled a desperate need for education and healthcare in this country. But because sisters have largely turned over leadership of these institutions to lay people, we tend to forget their contributions in founding them. So I'd like to start off by telling you a little bit about the Congregation of Sisters of St. Agnes. We were founded by Father Caspar Rerl. He was an Austrian missionary who came to the United States in 1845, intent on serving the German-speaking population in Wisconsin. So Father Rerl was given the territory bordered by Lake Michigan and Lake Winnebago and Milwaukee and Green Bay. So that comprised about 3,300 square miles. So he's credited with establishing 32 mission churches in this territory over his 35 years of ministry in Wisconsin. With Johnsburg as his base, he traveled mostly on foot to communities throughout this territory. Most of them he would visit about twice a year, but some he was able to visit about every 3 months or so. So since he wasn't able to be present at all his parishes all the time, he knew the best way to keep the faith alive in these communities was to educate the children. So the Germans even had a saying, build the school first and the school will build the church. So German missionaries in this country were seeing that as Catholic German children became anglicized, they began to fall away from the faith. And parents were afraid that the public schools would indoctrinate their children with Protestantism. So it was imperative in the minds of Father Rerl and these other German missionaries that Catholic German schools be established to maintain the faith, the language, and the culture of Catholic German immigrants and their children. So in the mid-19th century, Wisconsin school standards left quite a bit to be desired. On average, school terms would last for 4 months, although some districts went 8 months. By the 1860s, most schools had 2 3-month terms, beginning in November and April. So men who couldn't find work during the winter months on the farms would teach, and then women would fill in the summertime. So most of these teachers had no special training, and Father Rerl observed teachers who were incompetent, alcoholics, and a danger to the girls in the classrooms. He quickly realized he would need help. He would need to find help elsewhere to run his schools. And so he tried to get the Notre Dame sisters from Milwaukee to come up, and their mother superior came to the school at Mount Calvary, and she later wrote, quote, "My God, I have never seen such wilderness and such poverty before. A log cabin without chairs, without floor," end quote. So she didn't take that mission.
Yes, she did.
So on a home visit to Salzburg.
She did take that mission.
Oh, yeah, you're right. After a while, yeah, she did. Long story.
Assistant archivist.
So on a home visit to Salzburg from 1852 to 1855, Father Rarrell would visit convents all across Europe trying to recruit sisters to work with him, but he didn't have any luck. So it was partly because at the time in Europe, teaching really wasn't seen as an acceptable ministry for nuns. And also, I don't think these European nuns really had the same enthusiasm that Father Rarrell did for working on the Wisconsin frontier. So in 1855, he got permission to travel to Rome, and he went to the Basilica of St. Agnes, and he was praying at her tomb, and he had a vision. He saw St. Agnes leading a group of women who were wearing black and white. And so that was it. He knew he had to start his own society of teaching sisters. So he got an audience with Pope Pius IX and told him of his plan. He got the Pope's blessing, and the Pope said, don't give up, keep going. So newly energized, he returned to Wisconsin in 1855, settling in Barton, and he went about recruiting teachers. In a letter to a parish priest, he wrote, quote, "I heard that the Right Reverend Bishop, being with you, said that your young people look very intelligent. Would it not be a shame by such an intelligent people not to find a couple of pious virgins who would consecrate themselves entirely to God to serve him, guiding children to him? No excuse, Father, you ought to send me too." So finally, in 1858, 27-year-old German immigrant named Gertrude Rehberg heard of Father Rarrell and expressed her desire to become a sister. Soon, 2 more women joined her, and on August 12, 1858, these 3 women were invested into what would become the Congregation of Sisters of St. Agnes. They would teach at the boarding school that Father Rarrell had started in Barton, which was open to anyone, although he did ask the Protestant kids to pay 12 cents a month if they were able. So Sister Melanie Dulso recalled that when she arrived in Barton in 1861, the school welcomed, quote, "any child, Indian or white, healthy, blind, or crippled. At one time, there were 60 pupils," end quote. So having teaching sisters was one thing. Having skilled teaching sisters was something the congregation had to work toward. So Gertrude, who took the name Clara in religion, had received a good education growing up in Germany, but not all of Father Rarrell's recruits had that same advantage. Most were local teenage farm girls. And in 1854, the state legislature required that certain subjects must be taught in English, but most of the girls only spoke German. One sister recalled that if a girl was 14 and knew a little English, she was sent out to teach. Sister Francesca Bircher recalled that, quote, "Father Rarrell didn't let them in the front door before he had them out the back door." So when he would return from his mission trips to Barton, he would give the girls lessons in music, Christian doctrine, and elementary subjects, but these lessons were sporadic at best. The candidates themselves often felt unprepared to assume the responsibilities of a school, and the pastors weren't always thrilled with the quality of teachers being sent to them. In some parishes, sisters lasted only a year before they were asked to leave, and many sisters left the community altogether because of the lack of training and poor living conditions. But there were those sisters who were more advanced in their studies, and they were given the opportunity to study for the state teachers certification exam with the school superintendent in Fond du Lac. Father Earl is pretty savvy about this, knowing that if they had a license, they could teach in the public schools. And if they taught in the public schools, then that would mean a steady income for the congregation. So soon, many of these small towns would grow to include separate public and private schools. And in most cases, 2 sisters were sent out to teach in every town, one for the public school and one for the private school. I think it's safe to say that Father Earl had 2 guiding principles when it came to education. One, that every child is entitled to a quality education. And 2, that his sisters should be able to teach wherever they were needed. So this is where the woman who came to be known as Mother Agnes comes in. In 1862, 15-year-old Anne Marie Hazett made her way to the Congregation of Sisters of St. Agnes. When Father Earl first met her, the story goes, he placed his hand on her head and said, "Your name shall be Agnes." So he immediately saw so much potential in her that he honored her with the name of the congregation's patron saint. So 2 years later, at the age of 17, she was elected superior of the congregation, a title she would keep until her death in 1905. Throughout the 1860s, some tension developed between Mother Agnes and Father Earl related to the religious instruction the sisters were receiving. To a friend in 1969, she wrote that he had told her that he had not established the convent for praying, quote, but only to teach the ignorant children, end quote. Melanie also recalled that, quote, he just wanted a society of ladies to teach children and take care of his missions, end quote. While Mother Agnes was really looking for a true religious institute with structured religious formation and education for the sisters. So in 1870, with the encouragement from local pastors and Father Francis Haas, who was the sister's spiritual director, Mother Agnes moved the congregation to Fond du Lac. And at that time, Fond du Lac was the 2nd biggest city in the state, and it was also a railroad hub. So Father Earl and 6 sisters stayed behind in Barton. And for a time, there were actually 2 congregations of Sisters of St. Agnes, but that's another story for another time. That same year, the sisters took charge of St. John the Baptist School in Defiance, Ohio. And this was the first instance of sisters going out of the state to teach. So they would remain at St. John's until 1988. Within 10 years, CSA, now with 93 professed sisters, 16 novices, and 14 candidates, had expanded their teaching ministry to 34 schools in 6 states. But these numbers barely reflect the need for teachers throughout the country. The plenary councils of Baltimore had mandated that every parish in the country should open a school, and if possible, they should be staffed by religious. It was unrealistic to think that every parish, especially those in rural areas or poor urban settings, could afford a school. So despite it being a financial stretch, some parishes did what they could. At St. Peter's in Malone, they would send a wagon out every fall and collect food and other produce from the people living in St. Peter. And that would go to the sisters to help pay for their services. In Port Washington, sisters were provided housing, but they had to use a ladder to reach the 2nd floor where they lived. They only stayed a year. And the burden on the sisters was pretty great. In addition to teaching, they were expected to do church work, play the organ, and direct a choir in most of the parishes. But the sisters were gaining a reputation for being well-trained and effective teachers. From Yankton, South Dakota, Sister Magdalene Callahan wrote to Sister Seraphine Morrissey in 1887 that the bishop, quote, seemed greatly pleased with our progress. He wanted the sisters to write a course of study based on Fargo Public Schools for the Vicariate. He wanted our schools to be the model in Dakota. But not everyone acknowledged the quality of education the sisters were providing. In Carnegie, Pennsylvania, public school kids generally were admitted to the high school just automatically, but Catholic kids had to take an exam. And one year, all the Catholic kids supposedly failed this exam. So Sister Dionysia Rank marched down to the courthouse and demanded to see the exams. Needless to say, all the Catholic kids were allowed to go to high school that next year. So we can see from this applications for sisters record book how the need for sisters skyrocketed as sisters became more established. So this shows all the requests that came into the congregation between 1871 and 1935. So in the 1870s, you can see all the requests were for teachers, and most of them came from neighboring states. And in the far right column, you can see that they accepted a fair number of them. But now in the first decade of the 20th century, the requests are coming in from all over the country. So Pennsylvania, Arkansas, Texas, the Dakotas, Arizona. And they're looking for not just teachers, but sisters to open or staff other institutions like hospitals and sanitariums. St. Bede's College even wanted 15 sisters for domestic work. So CSA simply did not have the sisters to accommodate all these requests, especially cleaning up after a bunch of college kids. So I broke down this book into a chart because I like numbers. And during those 6.5 decades, CSA was only able to accommodate about 15% of the requests that they received for teachers. And this is just the school. During the same period, there were 43 requests for hospitals, 11 for domestic workers, 4 for sanitariums, 6 for orphanages, 2 for homes for the aged, and 1 retreat house. So you can see the explosion for need for teachers, especially in these last 25 years. Nearly 200 requests, and they were only able to accommodate 15 of them. So again, go back to those numbers I showed you at the beginning and imagine that this is taking place all over the country with all these other hundreds of women's religious congregations. And the schools were pretty crowded. This mission list from 1893 shows that St. Fidelis in Victoria, Kansas had 4 teachers for 273 students. You'll see a 5th teacher listed there. The 5th person listed is usually the homemaker for the convent. Sacred Heart in Yonkers had 2 teachers for 89 students, plus a music teacher. And because one of the sisters was sick, they sent a candidate out to help. But again, the candidates were usually teenagers, so I don't know how much help she was. So a little closer to home, we see St. Mary's here in town. They had 4 teachers for 225 students. So that year, CSA with its 173 professed sisters was responsible for 40 schools with 5,718 students. And their salaries very rarely reflected their responsibilities. In the early 20th century, sisters received 43% of what a lay woman would have been making, and only 32% of what a public school teacher would make, which was about $325. Religious brothers, of course, were paid about twice as much as sisters. So they tried to make up for this lack of funds with music teachers who could earn about twice as much as classroom teachers. They would also put on shows with the kids, and they would accept donations of food and services from their parishioners. So in short, sisters were subsidizing these Catholic schools by their low salaries. And we can get a sense of the finances of the parish, the growth or decline of the school, working conditions for the sisters, changes in the educational landscape, and how outside forces affected these parishes in our mission records book. So at St. Mary's, noted the German school, students paid 25 to 40 cents per month. But in Hays, Kansas, there was no fixed fee because of, quote, the poverty of the people who were new settlers. St. Peter's in Dane County, it operated as both a public school and a Catholic school because the public school wouldn't be built until 1920. 3 sisters were paid $450 for the year, but they did have to provide their own firewood. And then in Richfield, both the church and the school closed for failure on the part of the parish to cooperate with the pastor. So wouldn't you like to know what was happening there? All right, so some schools found creative ways to operate when communities had trouble supporting them. When St. Joseph's in St. Joseph, Wisconsin opened in 1875, it operated as a public school for 5 months of the year and a Catholic school for 5 months. The Great Depression caused the school to go public full-time in 1938 so that tax dollars would fully support the school. But the sisters stayed on another 30 years to teach. At St. Joseph's School in Decatur, it's a good example of the progression of educational opportunities that were available to students. So the school started out pretty typically in 1881 with 3 teachers and continued to grow. By 1913, there were 7 teachers plus 2 music teachers and 2 house sisters. 2 years later, they added commercial classes. And then in 1919, they added a high school. So this all jives with what's going on nationally with compulsory education becoming the norm and businesses needing workers who are trained in typing, bookkeeping, stenography, that sort of thing. So they were providing these services to help, get workers out to fill these new fields. And to help you visualize the breadth of CSA's teaching ministry, this map shows all the cities and towns in the United States where CSA is taught throughout its entire history. So if you want to click on that. So the blue pins represent 1 school in the town. Green pins are 2 schools. Orange pins are 3 schools, and purple are 5 schools. So, yeah, so you can see they're pretty well spread out. All right, yay. So, we're in the Southwest, the deep South. There's a cluster in Kansas, remember Hayes, Kansas, where they couldn't afford tuition. And, look how many schools opened up there. Can you zoom in on Kansas a little bit? So,
Oh, man.
and then you can head up toward Wisconsin. So as you would expect, there were tons of schools in Wisconsin, especially the eastern part of the state, where Father Rarrell founded CSA and had his missions. And then we also branched out to the UP and Illinois. We had quite a number of schools in Indiana. And then if you head further east, you can see we have a bunch of schools in Pennsylvania and New York. So again, not to belabor the point, you can go back. But think about the work of the sisters on a national scale. So tens of thousands of sisters, thousands of schools in every corner of the country. So this is just CSA. So as you can imagine, with this great need for teachers, teacher training was emphasized in the convent. So in 1874, CSA opened its convent school to educate the candidates and novices in subjects like physics, the classics, the Constitution, music, and pedagogy. By 1918, they began sending sisters to summer school classes at both Catholic and state colleges and universities as teaching became more professionalized and high schools were requiring that teachers have at least a bachelor's degree. So, and in 1924, the convent school became accredited by the state as a normal school. So just like most kids, those sisters look pretty pleased to be going to summer school. All right, so realizing that sisters still needed advanced training to meet the ever-increasing licensing requirements, in the early 1930s, CSA began sending its sisters to the State Teachers College in Oshkosh, which offered a 2-year teacher certification training program. And then in 1936, just as the sisters in the program were preparing to do their student teaching, they were told that they could not teach in public schools if they were wearing a veil. So Sister Vera Neighbor, who was in charge of teacher education for the congregation, went to Mother Aloysia. And like any good leader, Mother Aloysia turned the problem back on Sister Vera and said, "What should we do?" And Sister Vera said, well, we can either build a study house next to an established college, Catholic college, or we could start our own college. So they thought, the best way to keep the Agnesian spirit alive was to start their own college. So 8 months later, in September 1936, Marian College opened. And it was in the Mother House. The first door on the left is the entrance to Marian College. All right, so CSA starting its own college was not unusual for this time. Between 1920 and 1942, the number of Catholic women's colleges more than doubled from 54 to 117. So again, CSA is just part of this larger trend in Catholic education. A year after it opened, Marian began accepting lay students. There we go.
Oh, look at that.
All right, so the lay students, they should seem worthy in as far as moral character and high scholarship are concerned. So the school held evening and weekend classes to help sisters who were teaching full-time in town, and also teachers in rural areas who needed to stay on top of their licensing requirements. So how many of you are alums of Marian College or University? Okay. How many of you had Sister Margaret for a history professor? So there she is, as a young professor in the 1950s.
Circle around her.
Oh, okay. Wow, that was young.
So Marian was fully accredited in 1960, and in 1966, they moved to their new campus about a half mile down the road from the Mother House. So this September, they'll be celebrating their 90th anniversary and 60 years on their current campus.
Thanks.
So I'd like to switch now to CSA's healthcare ministries. So this slide shows a list of all the healthcare institutions that were either founded by CSA or CSA assumed responsibility for at some point. So don't worry, I'm not going to go through the history of all of these. What I want to do is briefly describe how 3 of our hospitals got founded, and then talk about some of the sisters who worked in healthcare. So you might be wondering why a bunch of teaching sisters suddenly decided to get into healthcare. Well, since the mid-1880s, civic leaders had been asking Mother Agnes to open up a hospital in town, and she knew she just didn't have the personnel or the resources to accommodate their request, so she declined it every time. Then other organizations tried to open a hospital in town. And after the Episcopalians' attempt fizzled in 1894, leaders again visited Mother Agnes. This time she told them that if the Fond du Lac community would provide appropriate support, they would seriously consider it. So a few days later, an organization called the Fond du Lac Businessmen's Association promised they could secure $55,000 in loans for the project. In January 1895, the CSA Board of Directors determined that since doctors and citizens of Fond du Lac had petitioned them, it would be an act of charity and humanity to move forward with building a hospital. So Mother Agnes sent 3 sisters to Chicago to be trained as nurses. And Dr. Frank Wiley, a prominent physician in town, went to Germany to study how to become a chief of staff of a hospital. But not everybody in the community was on board with the sisters running a hospital. At this time, hospitals were places where you went to die. And people thought, why do we need a hospital? People can die at home. And to them, Mother Agnes replied, quote, "Oh, we hope to cure people in our hospital, not kill them," end quote. So a few businessmen came to see Mother Agnes to voice their opposition to the hospital. They persisted in their arguments, and finally Mother Agnes stood up and she said, "Gentlemen, when Christ was on this earth, he not only preached, he also healed the sick on many occasions and in great numbers. Would you say that he did a good work in that?" They retorted, "Well, yes, but you're not Christ." Mother Agnes replied, "No, indeed, nor do we pretend to be, but Christ has called us to continue his work on earth, and as long as God permits illness, He will also expect his creatures to care for the sick. We have considered the matter and have decided to undertake the building of the hospital. We shall not reverse our decision. Good day, gentlemen. Thank you for your interest. So Mother Agnes wasn't going to take any guff from anyone. And that's one of the things I'd like you to take away from this presentation. The Sisters of St. Agnes have always had talented teachers and nurses, to be sure, but they were also excellent businesswomen and administrators at a time when very few women had the opportunity to display those skills. This is further evidenced by Mother Agnes's actions after the hospital first opened and was having difficulty attracting patients. She told the sisters to place lanterns in the windows so it appeared that the hospital was full, and that would encourage more people to come in. And then a local doctor also had his driver take his carriage racing down Division Street, so it looked like he was going to an emergency at the hospital. So talk about promotion and marketing. So within a year, the hospital was thriving. So CSA opened its second hospital in Hays, Kansas. Mother Agnes had promised the people of Hays she would do all she could to open a hospital there, since the nearest hospital was about 200 to 300 miles away. So sadly, she died in 1905, coincidentally in Hays, in this house, before she had a chance to do anything about the hospital. So doctors in Hays had been hearing about the success of St. Agnes Hospital, and the Capuchin pastor in Hays encouraged CSA to open a hospital there too. In a letter to Mother Antonia in 1909, Father Cassian Harlow wrote, quote, "Since the side of public sentiment for a hospital is at its height, I wish to urge you to send a trained nurse to Hays and to agree with the kind offers of Doctors Cadadell and Silverstein have made in that regard. They are anxious and determined to have it start in all events. And if you should refuse, they would get the Sisters of St. Joseph, who have already given their consent. Now, the doctors prefer to have the Sisters of St. Agnes for many reasons, and so do I, but they are bound to start. For now, it would not cost you anything. And if the hospital increases, this would be your best occasion to get a special house for the school sisters, as the people would feel more willing to do their best in this behalf," end quote. And then in a postscript, he continued, "The bishop is very anxious that a hospital be started at once, lest some Protestants will take up the matter and snatch this nice opportunity from us." So a little cajoling, some flattery, veiled threats, and a little bribery that building a convent for the school sisters seemed to do the trick. So they converted the second floor of the convent into a hospital. Mother Antonia provided 8 sisters, 1 administrator, 2 nurses, 2 cooks, and 3 for the laundry and cleaning. There was no elevator in the house, so if patients couldn't walk up the stairs, the doctors would carry them up. And sisters took up a collection in the countryside to defray the costs of converting and equipping the hospital. In 1915, CSA moved St. Anthony's out of the beach house, as that was known. And just an aside, when I first started working at CSA and I was hearing about the beach house, I'm thinking, it's Kansas, where is there a beach?
Yeah, right.
It took me probably a little longer than it should to realize the beach house was the name of the family who had owned the house previously. So anyway, they moved out of the beach house. They built this nice structure here in 1915. And then an addition was made in 1931. And this newspaper editorial proclaimed, quote, "It is common knowledge there would be no hospital addition to St. Anthony's had it not been for the vision and resourcefulness of Mother Joseph. Members of the General Committee believe Mother Joseph must indeed have waved a magic wand to find ways to finance so considerable an undertaking in time of acute financial distress. Then there are the Sisters of St. Agnes of Hays, those who do the actual work from day to day at the hospital and who are entrusted with the full responsibility of its functioning successfully. They too deserve in unlimited measure the gratitude of the community," end quote. So remember, this is 1931, some of the darkest days of the Depression, and CSA did not flinch from their commitment to the people of Western Kansas. And in return, these people continually supported the efforts of the sisters as the hospital was expanded and improved over the years. So finally, St. Clair Hospital. In 1937, doctors in Monroe wanted to create a medical center for their region of the state, but couldn't find any willing partners. They asked the parish priest for suggestions, and he recommended CSA. Doctor signatures were gathered on this petition to present to Mother Aloysia, and after meeting with some of the doctors, the congregation decided to accept the offer. St. Clair was different than St. Agnes and St. Anthony in that CSA had no previous relationship with the people of Monroe. And in fact, anti-Catholic sentiment was pretty high in the region. In the 1910s, the Anti-Catholic American Protective Association had their state headquarters in Monroe, where they also published their newspaper, The Menace. And in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan had a very strong presence there. So when St. Clair opened in 1939, the newspaper editors did their best to calm the angsty citizens. They wrote, quote, "The Sisters of St. Agnes, like all other nuns, are human. They have merely chosen another way of life than most of us. Although many people, misunderstanding, look upon nuns as isolated, strange, centering thought on things apart from the world, there will be found in the service of the sisters here a full human appreciation of day-to-day problems of existence, sympathy and a friendliness that will be as a helping hand to all, irrespective of religion, color, or race. Theirs is not a proselytizing mission here. It is a civic mission on a highly practical basis, inspired by the faith of their belief. They are businesswomen shouldering a tremendous investment. They are women of service, rendering with hand and with mind daily labors in the interest of others," end quote. So they're saying, don't freak out. The sisters are here to run a hospital, not convert you. And they're putting a lot of their own resources into it. And also they're human. So note they had to mention that twice. So 8 years later, community members were again lobbying the sisters, this time to expand the hospital. A county judge wrote to Mother Angeline about how things had changed. Quote, "At first they showed strong opposition and even fear on entering the hospital, afraid of the sisters they had heard spoken of in such derogatory terms for so many years. Then we began to hear words of praise and admiration as the sisters went about their duties of charity, kindness, and a deep consideration for their well-being. In other words, no priest or 6 priests could have done what the sisters have done for this community," end quote. So that's an incredible impact over such a short period of time. Competency played a role, of course, but I think it's also about the sisters quietly going about the mission of the church. So now I'd like to talk about some of our sisters' accomplishments, maybe some who weren't so quiet. One day in 1922, Sister Digna Desch was told not to report for work at the hospital the next day because the day after that, she would be taking over as director of St. Agnes Hospital School of Nursing. She was 25 years old. The School of Nursing had been established in 1910 after CSA had opened the hospital in Hayes a year earlier. And in 1917, they began to accept lay students because of the needs during World War I. So Sister Digna was told, this will only be for a year, but we all know how that turns out. During her 26 years as director, Sister Digna was responsible for the construction of the School of Nursing building in 1931 and for the school receiving full accreditation in 1940. It was one of the first schools in the country to attain that status. She also instituted the U.S. Nurse Cadet Training Program at the school during World War II, which graduated 240 nurses for the war effort with an accelerated program. In 1951, CSA asked Sister Digna to establish the St. Anthony Hospital School of Nursing in Hayes. And afterwards, she returned to Fond du Lac to teach nursing and sociology at Marian College for the remainder of her active ministry. So at a hospital conference in the early 1940s, Sister Blandine Izelli noticed a sign for an AA meeting. Not knowing what AA was, she went in. And she was fascinated by what the people were saying. She brought back what she learned to St. Clair Hospital, where she was a nurse, and started working with alcoholics. She was met with resistance from doctors, hospital administrators, and even her fellow sisters. They just didn't understand that alcoholism was a disease. So in 1951, Mother Albertonia told the Archbishop of Sister Blandine's activities and asked if she should allow it. The Archbishop replied, quote, "That's out. I won't tolerate that. The moral risk is too great," end quote. But Blandine persevered, holding strong to the belief that there's no shame in being an alcoholic, but only in choosing not to do anything about it. She slowly began to win over her critics, and St. Clair became nationally known for its alcohol treatment program. She spent 5 years as the administrator of St. Anthony Hospital in Hayes, bringing her knowledge there, and then returned to Fond du Lac in 1962 as a nationally recognized figure in alcohol treatment. Sister Irene Cohn spent 18 years as a clinical instructor and supervisor at St. Agnes Hospital, and then she was appointed administrator of St. Anthony Hospital just as planning of the new state-of-the-art facility was getting underway. She oversaw the purchase of the land and the design, construction, and move into the new building. And then she was given a new challenge in 1977 when CSA decided their nursing home, the Henry Boyle Catholic Home for the Aged, just could not keep up with community need for elder care. And so the congregation decided they were going to build a new facility called St. Francis Home. So Sister Irene directed the transition from the Boyle Home to St. Francis Home. Staying on top of industry trends, she oversaw the addition of independent living and assisted living in the St. Francis Home complex. She's credited with creating household communities where residents live in clusters and with common caregivers. So she was a visionary in elder care who knew that quality of life mattered just as much as quality of care. Sister Wilfrida Wagner spent 30 years at St. Agnes Hospital, the last 9 as administrator, taking over in 1954, just as CSA began its largest construction project to date. So they added an 8-story tower to the hospital with more operating rooms, waiting rooms, and labs. So in this picture, you can see the convent on top, the hospital with its new tower in the middle, and then the School of Nursing is in the foreground. Then in 1963, she arrived at St. Clair Hospital, which she described as practically bursting. Sister Susan Stuckey, a nurse at St. Clair, recalls, quote, "St. Clair was so busy at that time, we routinely had patients in the hall with screens at the head and the foot of the beds. I can remember typing being done for the lab and for x-ray on the stair landings. They literally kept a table with a typewriter on it," end quote. So under the direction of Sister Wilfrida, the hospital went through a major 2-phase renovation in the early 1970s to expand capacity by 150 beds and remodel other areas of the hospital. So Sister Mary Agreda Touchette on the left spent most of her career educating the next generation of nurses, turning Marian College's Division of Nursing into one of the best programs in the country. Sister Ann Jude Van Lannen, seated on the right, spent many years providing health care to Mosquito and Sumo Indians in Nicaragua. So Sister Ann Jude was troubled by the way the deaths of some of her own family members was handled here in the United States in hospitals, compared to the kind of death that she experienced in Nicaragua. And she talked it over with her friend and mentor, Sister Mary Agreda. And Sister Mary Agreda had recently read an article about hospice, which was something pretty new at the time. And so Sister Ann Jude went to the General Superior, Sister Judith Schmidt, and asked for permission to start investigating hospice with Sister Mary Agreda and Peg Cerny, the woman standing in the middle. And Peg was a lay nurse who had served at St. Agnes Hospital for many years. So after 3 years of jumping through all the regulatory hoops, they accepted their first hospice patient in 1980. And so what was unique about Hospice Hope was that they visited people in their homes, whereas at this time in the rest of the states, most patients had to stay in hospitals. So 20 years later, Hospice Home of Hope was established on land adjacent to the current CSA Mother House, and sisters continue to volunteer there to this day. By the 1980s, independent hospitals throughout the country were finding it necessary to collaborate to combat skyrocketing costs. In her roles as corporate director for sponsorship, general vicar of the community, and then general superior, Sister Mary Mollison was in the middle of multiple mergers involving CSA's hospitals. She helped negotiate the transfer of Waupun Memorial Hospital from the School Sisters of St. Francis to CSA in 1987. And then realizing the time was right for St. Clair Hospital and its longtime partner Monroe Clinic to consolidate their practices, she coordinated St. Clair's purchase of Monroe Clinic, although the new entity would take the name Monroe Clinic. And in Hays, Kansas, discussions about a merger between St. Anthony's and Hadley Regional Medical Center, a Methodist hospital. So the Protestants did get their hospital in Hays. These discussions have been going on since the 1960s. And in 1991, Sister Mary helped finally push it over the line to create Hays Medical Center. Sister Mary was a leader in the development of the Fond du Lac Regional Clinic in the mid-1980s and in creating the partnership between the doctors of the clinic and St. Agnes Hospital in 1993. And that partnership ultimately led to the formation of Agnesian Healthcare in 1997. But perhaps her greatest accomplishment was promoting lay leadership among CSA's institutions and guiding those leaders to integrate the mission of the church into daily operations as sisters began withdrawing from their traditional ministries. So what do we make of all of this? Sisters with limited education opened grade schools and became highly sought after educators. With no background in healthcare, they opened hospitals and a nursing home. They founded 2 schools of nursing and a college. Were they fearless? In some ways, yeah. But most importantly, they simply had faith that they were following the mission of the Gospels and that things would work out the way they were supposed to. So CSA is only one of the hundreds of religious congregations that stepped up to educate the children of this country and establish hundreds of hospitals, schools, and colleges when their communities turned to them for help. The value of what they've done is immeasurable. These records I've shown are a witness to the hard work and dedication of the sisters who, as the CSA mission statement puts it, participate in the mission of Christ by joyful service in the church.
Thank you.